do you make a recommendation to Internal Affairs?
Yes, in that case, you'd have to contact Internal Affairs.
I submit the foundation, Your Honor.
Okay. Members of the jury, I'm going to have you take a break while we figure out a fairly sticky legal issue here. We'll have you back fairly soon. All right, we are outside the hearing of the jury. Be seated, please. Mr. Nelson has asked for an opportunity to voir dire the witness for a possible objection outside the hearing of the jury. Mr. Nelson.
Good afternoon, Sergeant Pfluger.
Good afternoon, sir.
So in the normal course of your duties as a police sergeant in reviewing the use of force, what you're describing is what you would normally do, correct?
Yes.
So if a use of force is reported to you by an officer, in those circumstances, this use of force review occurs by the shift supervisor, correct?
Yes.
And the shift supervisor would first and foremost report to the scene, correct?
Yes.
After that point, you would interview the officers that were involved, correct?
Yes.
You may interview the person upon whom force was used, right?
Yes.
You may interview witnesses to the use of force if they exist, correct?
Yes.
You may review body-worn cameras, other evidence, photographs, whatever else may be a part of that process, right?
Yes.
And it is much greater in it's a limited, but it's a bigger scope, right?
Yes.
When a use of force incident becomes a critical incident, however, does your role change?
I would no longer do a use of force in a critical incident,
Right.
nor would I do it if someone had suffered an injury, if they were handcuffed. That goes up the chain then to lieutenant in internal affairs.
Okay. So in certain circumstances, you would not be required to do that, right?
Correct.
And also, in addition, Your Honor, or Sergeant Pfluger, I apologize, you did not do any of that use of force use of force review on May 25th of 2020, did you?
No.
You didn't speak with the officers in depth about what happened, correct?
No.
You didn't interview any of the witnesses that were at the scene, did you?
No.
And you didn't review the body-worn cameras that night, did you?
No.
In preparation for your testimony, were you given the entirety of the case file for this case?
No.
I mean, do you have 50,000 pages of police reports?
No.
Have you reviewed any of the interviews from any of the witnesses?
No.
Have you reviewed any of the statements that were given relevant to this case by any of the involved officers from those who did give statements?
No.
All right. So in this case, in preparation, were you allowed to watch the entirety of all of the body-worn cameras?
I think I did.
Okay. And that was in preparation or while you were being interviewed with the state prosecutors, right?
Correct.
Okay. So in terms of the information you have a limited amount of information, which would be limited to just a review of the body-worn cameras.
Yes.
And that would not be the normal course for a sergeant's use of force review.
Yes.
I'm still not clear as to who made the decision in this case, so, Mr. Swisher, I don't have very much of a foundation for who gave this opinion, or gave an opinion in this case. Could you follow up with?
I'm sorry, I had a hard time hearing.
I don't think I have a foundation yet. It sounds like on a critical incident, it gets passed up. Who made, I don't know who made the decision on use of force.
Well, there was.
Could you maybe inquire, see where?
I can, Your Honor. I want to just clean up one part of the record first. In terms of reviewing the body-worn camera footage with the state, I think the question was state prosecutors. You didn't review them with the state prosecutors, but you have reviewed those with prosecutors. Is that correct?
Correct.
Like other prosecutors, not associated with this particular case.
Right.
Is that right?
Yes.
Now, to answer the court's question, in terms of whether or not you did a use of force review pursuant to the policy, in this particular case, you did not, correct?
Correct.
Right? You passed the scene along and followed the critical incident policy, per the critical incident guidelines. Is that right?
Yes.
However, in the course of your duties as a shift sergeant, you do force reviews. Is that right?
Yes.
You follow the policy in conducting supervisory force reviews.
Yes.
Right? And if we could pull up the exhibit again, 222. You could go to the next page, please. Okay. In conducting a force review, if you could please call out Roman I. You contact the internal affairs unit commander by phone if the force used appears to be unreasonable or constitute possible misconduct. Is that right?
Yes.
So you make a threshold assessment of whether or not force is excessive or could constitute possible misconduct. True?
True.
And if you could go to the next page. And call out B. And again, based on the totality of information available at the time, if you as a supervisor feel that the use of force may have been unreasonable or not within policy, you can state so in your supervisor force review. Is that right?
Yes.
And that's the policy that you follow.
Yes.
So, Your Honor, I don't believe that this is a lack of foundation. He has clearly qualified to give an opinion, and a limited opinion, that based on his preliminary review, as stated and disclosed, he believed that the restraint should have ended very shortly after Mr. Floyd was taken to the ground, handcuffed, and no longer resisting. And that's the sum and substance of the opinion I intend to offer.
If I could just follow up a couple questions. In this particular case, the reason you called the lieutenant was because Mr. Floyd died, right?
I would have called the lieutenant first because force was used and he was in handcuffs. Any force that results or that's used when somebody's in handcuffs requires me to call the lieutenant and internal affairs.
Right. So that went up the chain naturally that way. And then when Mr. Floyd died, this use of force policy is replaced with the critical incident policy. Is
Yes.
that correct? So, Your Honor, I guess the issue here is this is exactly what the motions in limine were designed to effectuate. This officer, Sergeant Pluger, did not make this determination. He has not done a use of force review as he would have done in this policy. He has not reviewed the entirety of the evidence in this particular case. And while he may have seen certain body camera footage and made some determination based on that limited information, he hasn't seen everything else. And so it is not within his purview, and this is what the motion in limine was specifically designed for.
Mr. Slisher, as I understood it, you're asking a narrower opinion?
That's correct, Your Honor. I'm asking, exactly what I proffered, that in his opinion, The force should have ended very shortly after Mr. Floyd was on the ground, handcuffed in the prone position and no longer resistant.
You can ask that one question. Let's bring the jury back. Is this probably going to be our last witness? How long is that?
Another one in the hall. We could get him done in a half hour.
Okay. True. Okay. We'll see how it goes. All right, previous questions withdrawn. Mr. Slisher, would you ask your question?
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, based on your review of the body-worn camera footage, do you have an opinion as to when the restraint of Mr. Floyd should have ended in this encounter?
Yes.
What is it?
When Mr. Floyd was no longer offering up any resistance to the officers, they could have ended the restraint.
And that was after he was handcuffed and on the ground and no longer resistant.
Correct.
Thank you. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Mr. Nelson.
Good afternoon, Sergeant Pluger.
Good afternoon, sir.
Thank you for being with us today. A few questions that I had to follow up on with you. When a police officer under your command uses force, are they required to immediately notify you?
It depends on the type of force.
Okay. Are there certain circumstances where you may get a phone call or a radio dispatch immediately?
Yes.
Are there certain circumstances or situations where you may get a phone call or a report of a use of force within 10 to 15 minutes?
Yes.
Are there circumstances where you may get a use of force report or from an officer from an hour or two later?
Not one that would cause me to have to go to the scene. That would be more immediate. They'd want to let me know right away because I need to get out there and interview the subject.
Right. But it could happen within more than, say, 10, 15, 20 minutes that you get that notification.
Yes.
It would be fair to say that in certain types of use of force, there may be other, or to force cases, there may be other activities that the officer needs to do after the use of force. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
So they may use force against suspect number 1, but then they have to apprehend suspect number 2, for example, right?
Yes.
And they've used force on number 1, but they get number 2 detained and it takes some time, then they call you, right?
Yes.
Or, for example, an officer may use force on someone, conduct some additional investigation, whether it be interviewing witnesses or gathering evidence, and then call you to report the use of force, right?
Yes.
Is there a policy within the Minneapolis Police Department that requires an officer who uses force to do that through dispatch channels?
No.
They could call you on your cell phone.
Yes.
They could send you a text.
Yes.
Basically, their requirement is that they need to reach out to you and say, hey, we need you to come to the scene, right? We
Yes.
use force. Now, just a second. Showing you Exhibit 221. Policy 5-306 regarding medical assistance. What do the first 4 words after medical assistance read?
As soon as reasonably.
Practical, right? Oh,
Yeah,
I
that's
said
fine.
4. Ha! Sorry, you got me. As soon as reasonably practical, right?
Correct.
An officer has to use or render medical assistance as soon as is reasonably practical, correct?
Yes.
Now, are you familiar generally with the Minneapolis Police Department's critical decision-making model?
Somewhat.
Essentially, when a police officer is engaged in a situation, would you agree that an officer is constantly taking in new information, processing that information, comparing it to what happened before, and making decisions based on information as it comes in?
Yes.
And information as an officer is dealing with the situation can change, right?
Yes.
And that information that they take in may change or modify the behavior in response to the situation, right?
Yes.
So for example, sometimes an officer may decide to use a taser or a conducted electricity unit, right? But then realize, that's not enough, I better get my gun out, based on the threat that they perceive, right?
Yes.
Or vice versa, they may have their gun drawn, realize that's too much force, put it away, and take out a different tool that they have, right?
Yes.
So officers are constantly assessing and reassessing a situation based upon the information as it comes to them. Agreed?
Yes.
You were an officer for what, 27 years, I think you said. You've, I'm assuming, arrested hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals during your career.
Yes.
You've had to use force yourself.
Yes.
And would you agree with the general premise that the use of force is not necessarily attractive?
Yes.
Sometimes officers have to do very violent things. Agreed?
Yes.
It's a dangerous job.
Correct.
Have you ever heard the term hold for EMS? An officer says, I held him for EMS.
I'm not familiar with that.
Okay. So if you are involved in a use of force situation and an officer calls for medics, right? And I'm going to strike that. An officer decides to use the maximal restraint or the hobble, right? But a medical emergency arises and they call for EMS. Would it be consistent with the critical decision-making policy to say, I'm not going to hobble this person because I know EMS is on the way?
Objection, Your Honor. Sidebar.
All right, rephrase.
I'll rephrase, thank you. Assume an officer was engaged in a struggle with a suspect and decided to use the maximal restraint technique, but then the suspect had a medical emergency, would it be common for the officer to decide, I'm not going to use the maximal restraint technique at this point. I'm going to hold this suspect in place until EMS gets here?
Objection calls for speculation.
So your scenario is an officer's planning to use the hobble and hasn't put it on yet, and then the suspect has a medical emergency, and then they decide not to use them, just hold them?
Right.
Yes.
When a maximal restraint technique is applied, the suspect is essentially handcuffed behind their back, and through a series of belts, their legs are bent at kind of an upward angle and then connected to some sort of device, right, around the waist.
I don't think they bend back towards the back anymore. They like to keep them straight.
Straight.
Right.
So, but there's a tie between the ankles and the waist, essentially.
Correct.
Right? And if EMS is on their way, the restraint, you've got to take that off and can delay medical care. Agreed?
You're saying I'm sorry, would you just repeat that?
If an officer uses the maximal restraint technique and EMS has to come, the officers have to remove that potentially, right?
Correct.
And that can delay medical treatment.
Sure.
Now, again, in your 27 years as a police officer, have you had to deal with crowds of people that form and watch your activity?
Yes.
In your experience as a police officer, especially in the more recent era, have you been in a situation where bystanders begin to film you and your activities?
Yes.
Does that happen more and more these days than it did 5 years ago?
Yes.
And have you been in a situation in your career as a law enforcement officer where the crowd starts to yell at you
Yes.
or becomes a little more volatile?
Yes.
As an officer, does that cause you concern?
Yes.
Generally speaking, as an officer with 27 years of experience, if you're dealing with one potential suspect and then a new perceived threat emerges, but you know that person needs medical attention, do you deal with the medical attention and ignore the threat, or do you deal with the threat and then deal with the medical attention?
I guess you'd have to deal with both kind of simultaneously.
And that depends on the circumstances. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
So, for example, if you were in a gun battle and someone was shooting at you and someone went into cardiac arrest, would you stop what you were doing to mitigate the threat, or in order to immediately perform CPR? Or would you continue with the threat?
I'd mitigate that threat to me.
You've gone through all of the standard training of the Minneapolis Police Department.
Yes.
You had to deal with suspects who've been rendered unconscious.
Occasionally.
You're aware that the Minneapolis Police Department, where the training indicates that you need to be careful because when someone comes back out of unconsciousness, they can become more volatile than they were before?
That can happen, yes.
You were asked a series of questions about about the sergeant's use of force review, right? A force review.
Yes.
And in a force review, there are certain things that you're required to do, correct?
Yes.
That would include having a conversation with the involved officer, right?
Right.
That would involve potentially having a conversation with the suspect upon whom force was used, agreed?
Yes.
Review of the body-worn cameras, right?
Yes.
review of any other evidence that may exist, such as witness statements, photographs, phone records, whatever it may consist of, right?
Yes.
It's not a huge, very thorough investigation. It's kind of a cursory look, right?
Correct.
And but there's more to it than simply watching a body-worn camera, right?
Yes.
In this particular case, when you arrived on scene, you initially spoke with Officers King and Lane, and Mr. Chauvin was present in that scene.
Yes.
And he was listening as Officer King and Lane told you what had just happened.
Yes.
Now, when, in your experience as a police officer, when a supervisor's use of force, well, strike that. When one group of officers goes to a scene and a second shows up to assist, whose arrest is that? Is it the original officer or the assisting officers?
Should be the original officer.
And so when you're reviewing a circumstance, is it going to be, would it be your policy to talk to the arresting officers or the assisting officers first to find out what happened?
I guess I wouldn't care one way or the other. Whoever wants to tell me the story.
Okay. And if one officer is responsible for it, you're going to go to that officer, right?
Right.
And if two officers, you're going to ask them both.
Correct.
And if all of the officers are standing around and they're talking about it, that's what you need to do initially, right?
Correct.
Now, you were discussing again in this particular incident, you were at, when you arrived on scene, you asked, you kind of gave some direction to these officers, right?
Yes.
And at the point that you arrived on scene, you knew it was a use of force incident, but it was not what you call a critical incident. Agreed?
Agreed.
Because at that point, Mr. Floyd, to the best of your knowledge, was still alive.
Right.
If you know what the answer to that is.
One more time, sir.
At the point that you were initially on scene, you had no information that Mr. Floyd was deceased, right?
Correct.
Now, you then instructed the officers to do a few things, right? Potentially talk to witnesses, and then two officers to go down to the hospital with you.
Yes.
In their squad car.
Yes.
All right. And we saw this video where you instructed Officer Chauvin to try to get some witness statements, things of that nature, right?
Yes.
And he made the comment that he would try, but the crowd seemed pretty hostile.
Yes.
Officer Chauvin and Officer Tao ended up at the hospital with you,
They did.
and Officer King and Officer Lane remained on scene, right?
Yes.
At some point when you learned that Mr. Floyd had died, the use of force review was no longer reviewed by you, correct?
Correct.
Someone died, well, and I believe even per policy, if someone was a use of force occurred while someone was in handcuffs, that policy required you to reach out to your superiors, right?
That's correct.
And if Mr. Floyd had not died, you would have not conducted a use of force review, correct?
Correct.
You would have left it to the higher ups, the people up the chain of command.
Right, since he sustained an injury in handcuffs.
Right. And likewise, when a suspect dies in police custody, you don't do a use of force review.
Right.
And you did not do a use of force review in this case, did you?
No.
Now, you talked about when it became a critical incident, the officers ended up at room 100 down at City Hall. I think you initially said it was the courthouse, but you're talking about City Hall across the street.
Yes, I said it wrong.
And that's a room that's maintained by the Minneapolis Police Administration, right?
Right.
That's where any involved officers go during a critical incident.
Right.
for officers who are involved or potentially witnesses to a critical incident.
Correct.
And you understand that the 4 involved officers were each individually transported to room 100, right?
I believe that was the case.
And you referenced that at that point, kind of the critical incident policy takes over and certain things have to happen pursuant to the critical incident policy, right?
Yes.
A whole host of things have to happen, right?
Yes.
You referenced interviews of officers. You have no idea if interviews of officers occurred in room 100 on or about May 25th, 2020 or May 26th of 2020.
I'm not positive, no.
That's one thing that could potentially happen, right?
Yes.
But not necessarily.
Right.
Now, you testified that kind of at the end of the night, Officer Lane, or while the end of your involvement, Officer Lane handed you a couple of pieces of evidence that pertained to the arrest back at 38th in Chicago, right?
Correct.
Or the incident at 38th in Chicago, right?
Yes.
Do you recall what those items were?
I recall one for sure was a slip of paper with a name from one of the parties in the vehicle that he'd gotten.
Okay. Do you recall the other being an identification card?
I think so.
And do you remember the name of the person that was on the slip of paper?
I don't.
Would it refresh your recollection to review your report that you drafted that night?
Yes.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor? Counsel, it's page 117. I'll just read that in your head. Does that refresh your recollection?
Yes.
What was the name on the piece of paper? Shawanda Hill?
Shawana Hill.
And the other item that he handed you was an Minnesota identification card, correct?
Correct.
With the name of William Smythe?
Yes.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
You're in, please.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, you were asked whether you agree with the proposition that sometimes police officers have to do violent things, and you agree with that, correct?
Yes.
But sometimes police officers should not do violent things, isn't that right?
Yes.
You were asked about the critical thinking model that's used and adopted by the Minneapolis Police Department, correct?
Correct.
And that's a model that requires officers to continually take in information, evaluate it, reevaluate it, reassess, and if necessary, adjust their conduct, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And as you stated under questioning by defense counsel, sometimes the information they're taking in would cause the officer to need to take more drastic measures, fair?
Yes.
But sometimes the information that the officer would take in would cause them to need to reevaluate what they're doing and use less drastic measures, correct?
Yes.
Some of the information that might be relevant is whether or not the subject is resisting, correct?
Could you say that one more?
One of the pieces of the information the officer may need to take in and evaluate is whether the subject is resisting, correct?
Yes.
And if the subject is not resisting, there is no longer a need to continue to restrain them, correct?
Yes.
And other information that might be helpful in making an assessment is to determine whether or not the subject is continuing to breathe, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, it is getting to the, at this point, Mr. Slisher, if you would rephrase.
Would it be important for an
Response was stricken.
Would it be reasonable then in the critical thinking model for an officer to determine and take in information about the subject's medical condition?
Yes.
For example, if the subject is no longer breathing, would it be important for the officer to take that into account to reassess and reevaluate what they're doing?
Yes.
Or if the subject no longer has a pulse, for example, would that be important information in the critical thinking model for the officer to take in, consider, and decide to maybe take a different step?
Yes.
And in such a case, would it be possible then that the officer would not need to do something violent, but would need to do something less violent,
Yes.
like render medical assistance?
Yes.
You were asked about a threat assessment, is that right?
Yes.
And you were asked about an example of whether an officer would perceive a threat if there was a gun battle and need to make a determination between medical attention and that kind of extreme threat, right?
Yes.
You reviewed the body-worn cameras, correct?
I've reviewed body-worn camera footage.
You didn't see a gun battle?
No.
Nothing further.
So the critical decision-making model requires the officers to take in multiple pieces of information and decide how to act based on the circumstances, right?
Yes.
Other factors they may consider is the size of a crowd, right?
Yes.
Their tactical position,
Yes.
traffic,
Sure.
rendering medical aid to a person in the middle of a busy street while buses and cars are turning. That may not be the best decision for an officer to make.
Right.
Rendering medical aid or while trying to deal with other people who are upset with you or volatile towards you may come into to play. Agreed?
Yes.
An officer who is essentially in a tactical disadvantage, that will come into play.
Yes.
Officers have to look at lots of different bits of information and decide how to proceed based on the totality of the circumstances and not just one single fact. Agreed?
Yes.
No further questions.
Nothing further? Briefly?
And an officer needs to consider whether other sources of information might be relevant to the need to render medical aid, correct?
Yes.
Including people telling the officer that a person was in need of medical assistance. That might be important for them to consider.
Sure.
And if somebody's communicating this in a desperate fashion, that doesn't necessarily constitute a threat to the officer, does it?
Sustained.
I have nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you, Sergeant. You may step down.
Sir.
All right, members of the jury, we're going to adjourn for the day. We'll try and start up again around 9:15 tomorrow. We'll see you then.
If I could talk into it, I can myself. Test one. Yep, it's broken. Test one, two. Test. It's broken. I restart the fucking. So I think it's broken.
I just want to say that, I came to this country when I was 18, just finished high school, came over here. I went to U.S. Army to serve 20 years, active duty, 24/7, and retire. Okay? For too long, I have put up with a lot of in silence. Excuse me the language. Too afraid to speak out, fearing more abuse and discrimination. Yeah. Then when I came out of the Army, I said, I'm going to make it a better community where I go to, wherever I live to serve. I do my best, do what is right. And then, in the last few years, things are just getting worse and worse. But there are some ignorant people that will come up to me and say that I don't look American or patriotic enough. People question my patriotism, that I don't look American enough. They could not get over this face. I want to show you something. I want to tell you, because I'm not afraid. I don't have to live in fear, intimidation, or insults. I'm 69 years old, and I'm going to show you what patriotism, the questions about patriotism looks like. Here is my proof. Right? This is sustained through my service in the U.S. military. Now, is this patriot enough? I'm not ashamed to walk around anymore. Before I felt inhibited. People looked at me strange. And they to question me, my loyalty to this country. I don't look American enough. Now, last I read the U.S. Constitution, we the people, we are all the same. We are equal. Not this, you are more superior, you are not. We are all the same. We all have, even I have some mindless prejudice sometimes that I caught myself. Oh, I don't like the way you dress, it's not the same. But prejudice is hate. And that hate, it can be changed. We are human. We need to be kinder, gentler to one another, because we are all the same. We are one human being on this earth.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.
and the work that we get a chance to do together on a bipartisan basis. Of course, what brings us here now is this immediate humanitarian crisis. The Border Patrol and Health and Human Services, all the government officials tell us they are doing the best they can, but they're being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. And the smugglers and the cartels are doing this on purpose because they know getting paid by the head for as many people as they can get into the country, covering Border Patrol up with children to take care of, taking them off the front line presents an opportunity for them to smuggle drugs, methamphetamine, heroin, and fentanyl into the United States. So we thought it was really important to be able to bring our colleagues from the Senate who are not from border states, who don't get to come here as often as Senator Cruz and I do, to show them this great region. And it's been a wonderful day. We got here last night, had a chance to go out on some nighttime operations with the Border Patrol. But it's great to welcome them. But here's the bottom line. The Border Patrol and Health and Human Services and the non-governmental organizations that are struggling to deal with this flood of humanity tell us they cannot get ahead of this flood of humanity without policy changes in Washington, D.C. The smugglers, the drug runners, they understand our laws and they know how to exploit them to their benefit. So ending catch and release, making sure people with legitimate claims get to present them to an immigration judge, I think should be a priority. And then perhaps we can begin to look at other parts of our broken immigration system. But I'm very proud of the fact that we had such an enthusiastic turnout among all these great colleagues in the United States Senate. I'm glad they're here. I think you'll hear from them. They had a great educational experience. Let me turn it over to my colleague and friend, Senator Cruz.
Thank you, John. It is great to be back in the Rio Grande Valley. It is terrific that John and I were able to bring 18 senators down to Texas, down to the Valley, to see firsthand the crisis that is unfolding here. All of us today witnessed the Biden cages. What is occurring here on the border is heartbreaking, and it is a tragedy. You know, as we stand by the banks of the Rio Grande, we have an army of TV cameras here. It is striking that not a single one of these cameras is allowed in the Donna facility. We requested that media accompany us in the facility. The Biden administration said no. The Trump administration had allowed media inside facilities like that. The Obama administration had allowed media inside facilities like that. The George W. Bush administration had. The Bill Clinton administration had. But the Biden administration wants to hide what is going on here. Not only that, but a number of us took pictures and took videos because the American people have a right to know what is happening here. And the Biden administration sent down political handlers to try to keep silent, to try to keep the American people not knowing what's going on. The Donna facility is a giant tent city built with a capacity of 250. It has nearly 4,000 people in it. We saw cages after cages after cages of little girls, of little boys, lying side by side, touching each other, covered with reflective emergency blankets. There was no 6-foot space. There was no 3-foot space. There wasn't a 3-inch space between the children lined up one after the other after the other. And children as young as infants. We saw playpens with infants and toddlers playing. We also saw a group of children who just today tested positive for COVID-19. The Donna facility alone reports roughly 10% of the individuals being held there are testing positive for COVID-19. Rates dramatically higher than the U.S. population, and the Biden administration is taking people who are testing positive for COVID-19 and locking them in cages side by side. This is inhumane, it is wrong, and it is the direct consequence of policy decisions by the Biden administration to stop building the wall, to return to catch and release, and to end the stay in Mexico policy. A number of us are releasing those photographs and releasing those videos so the American people can see what's happening here. This needs to stop. It is a crisis, it is a tragedy, and it is a man-made crisis. This was avoidable, this was preventable, and regardless of your party, Republican,